Thanks very much, Greg, and welcome all. Now, there's been many great institutions, of course, that have started by one person out of their garage or from their home, and I, of course, can think of Apple Corporation and, of course, the CIS. Now, Greg hasn't quite made the same money that the people who formed Apple have, but he has made a great contribution by building up the CIS and its terrific contributions to public debate. Now, I was chatting to Greg recently, and he said something which wasn't at all surprising: Chicago school approach to regulation, which I can interpret as anybody would as being markets rarely fail, and when they do, if governments seek to intervene or regulate in a way to address the market failure, they'll usually muck it up, so best they don't bother. And I can verbal Greg, since I'm at the microphone and he's not. You could interpret that to say, well, even the ACCC probably shouldn't exist, or it's inimical to a market economy. And indeed, Greg, I have actually been here a couple of times because I was a member of the CIS, so it must have been a very strange thing when a member of the CIS gets appointed to chair a regulator. Probably a first, I would imagine. Right, okay. Damn. Lost that. Anyway, the point I wanted to make today is that I think the ACCC plays a crucial role in a market economy, that really an effectively operating ACCC is fundamental to an effectively operating market economy. And I just want to explain that by making three different points. The first one is that the act under which we work is really sets quite broad boundaries within which business operate. It's not a narrow constraining act, it really sets quite broad boundaries. Secondly, that we actually do achieve a lot directly, but we probably achieve a lot more indirectly, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And thirdly, and in a sense this is almost the key point, everybody in the community, I mean, we're talking about the ACCC's profile, public profile, I mean, part of that is that everybody in the community has a view about what the ACCC should or shouldn't be doing. I termed it recently, we're all economic philosophers. We all have a view about what the Act should say we shouldn't do and how we go about our job. And indeed, the dominant by far criticism of the ACCC is not that we're intervening too much. By far the dominant, 90% of the criticism is that we're not doing enough. And I just want to make that point and put that all together to make the point that I think the ACCC, us doing our role and being seen to do our role, is a fundamental underpinning of a market economy. So let me just talk a bit about the broad boundaries that we set, and a couple of people here have heard me say this before, but the essence of the ACCC's role, I think, really comes from two quotes from Adam Smith. The first quote is the famous one, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. I mean, that is the underpinning quote of a market economy. It speaks of the power of the profit motive as the crucial engine of economic growth and as I say, a market economy. And I was explaining to Peter here that I spent my first 10 years in development economics, and that really taught me that if you want economic growth, a lower role for government, free markets is really the way to do it. You could easily see when governments intervened too much that it was actually working against economic growth. So I've got no problem that free markets and maximum competition work best. But of course that leads to the second quote, and this is the only quote that competition lawyers know from Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. It's that people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. I remember when I was using those two quotes at a particular time inside the Commission, the people said, oh look, everybody's heard of the second quote, don't mention that, but they hadn't heard of the first. I think the second quote though shows that you really do need boundaries within which the profit motive works. I mean, it's a fantastic force for good. It drives the economy, but it has to work within boundaries, and those boundaries are set by a range of organisations, I guess, but many of the critical boundaries are set by the ACCC and its Act. And I guess the other point I'd make is that for ACCC to be successful, it's actually got to believe in both quotes. You've got to have a real appreciation of both, not just one of them. Just to illustrate the broad boundaries, the law that we work within is actually pretty simple. I mean, the book that describes our law is, I call it the Bible. It's been written by Russell Miller. I think it's up to his 35th edition now. It's 2,300 pages long, but really you can describe the essence of our Act. I've said before on the back of a postage stamp. That's probably a bit harsh, but the back of an envelope. I mean, in its essence, it's actually really, really simple. On the competition side, it's don't have a merger which substantially lessens competition. It's don't misuse your market power for an anti-competitive purpose, and it's don't enter into agreements that substantially lessen competition or enter into cartels. It's pretty broad and fairly straightforward. On the consumer side, it's don't mislead consumers, it's don't engage in unconscionable conduct, and it's don't sell consumers unsafe goods. Again, that's the essence of our consumer law. Of course, where markets can't work, particularly because there's monopoly infrastructure like Telstra's copper wire or railway tracks or whatever, then of course we are also the economic regulator of infrastructure, and there the laws are much more prescriptive. I don't deny that at all, but they're prescriptive where you're dealing with monopolies. Where you're just dealing with the Competition and Consumer Act, I think they provide fairly broad boundaries within which companies can work. And the other point to make is we actually work through the courts, by and large. So where you have a contested matter, if we think somebody has breached the Consumer or Competition Act, we're the investigator, but it's the courts who determine it. So we have to prove our case to the courts. We've got to gather all the evidence up. I'm often amused when we were talking about Alan Jones on our table, but whether it's Alan Jones or others, they see something out there and they say the ACCC should stop that. Well, if you're talking about the core Competition and Consumer Act, we can't stop anything. All we can do is say, I mean, if it's an enforcement matter, I'm not talking about a merger, but you know, it's we can't tell anybody to stop anything. If we think that they're doing something wrong and they want to keep doing it, we've actually got to take them to court. Now, on a complex competition matter, that may take us 18 months to gather the evidence to take it to court, because, of course, if we take it to court and are ill-prepared and get smashed, then the media will rightly criticise us. So it takes a long time to get ready for court. It takes a long time for the court to hear the matter. There's a couple of matters we've got on foot at the moment. One in particular, we're still 2 years out waiting for the judgment. These things take a long time. So we don't have powers, in essence, to stop most of what people want us to stop. We work through the courts. Now, that's the way I think it should be. There's competition regulators overseas who have administrative power. They can find themselves that someone has breached their act, and they can fine them. So they have administrative power, but we don't want that. We prefer our system where we work through the courts. So I wasn't in any way complaining about all that. I was simply explaining to people who may not be as day-to-day familiar with what we do that we are working, I think, within quite broad boundaries, and effectively, in terms of enforcement activity, we work through the courts. Now, I think the second point I wanted to make is just a point about how we are actually effective, and to some extent we're effective directly by what we do. So, you know, we've got a couple of cartel over the last year. We've probably taken people to court in relation to a couple of cartel matters. We've got one agreement which lessens competition. A couple of months ago we took Visa to court for allegations around misuse of market power. We probably assess over 300 merger applications a year. Most of those go through pretty quickly. We did oppose Channel 7 getting hold of Consolidated Media Holdings. We did insist on APA giving an undertaking to divest a pipeline when they bought out Hastings, otherwise they'd have had a complete monopoly on the East Coast. So there are high-profile mergers which grab everybody's attention, but the majority of them go through fairly quickly. On the consumer side, we are fairly active. We probably take 30 people or more than 30 actions in court a year, companies to court. So we took Apple to court over suggesting that their new iPad was 4G. It was actually called iPad plus 4G. It wasn't 4G, it was something below 4G, and Samsung, who had a 4G product out there, didn't think this was a very good idea, that their competitor was saying they were 4G when they weren't, and Samsung had a 4G product out there, so we intervened in that case. We're taking action at the moment against companies like Hewlett-Packard and Harvey Norman for what we allege is not misleading consumers about what their consumer guarantee rights would be. You may have noticed we're doing a lot of action in relation to energy companies on door-to-door selling, which is people knocking on people's doors, trying to sell them energy, and we would argue breaching the unsolicited selling provisions, often misleading consumers, and sometimes engaging in unconscionable conduct. So, and then we're the safety regulator as well, so we recently took Cotton On Kids to court for selling unsafe kids' nightwear. They ended up paying a fine of $1 million, so that really showed how the court took that quite seriously. And as I say, we're also the regulator, so we regulate everything from the NBN Telstra through to the wheat ports on the mainly on the in South Australia and Western Australia. So that's what we do directly, which people see, and you know, it is quite a long list of impressive things we do, but I think we're actually, in a sense, more effective in what you don't see. So we get about 160,000 complaints a year. We do a lot of investigations that pretty quickly dealt with, and it's actually a very effective process. We might get a complaint from somebody, we'll ring up the company, and the company will, they're getting a call from the ACCC. Many of these are quite small companies, and they'll back off fairly quickly and change their behaviour. We often send warning letters. There's a whole range of administrative action that nobody ever hears about, because when we do it administratively, the deal is it doesn't become public, and if you just stop what you're doing, that's fine. These are usually fairly obvious things that would otherwise amount to a breach of the Act. So there's all that going on. But in addition to that, which I think is, in a sense, even more powerful, and to some extent we were talking about it at the table, is there's a whole lot of things that don't happen because people know we're there, they know we'll enforce the Act, and so they don't even bother to do it. So we were talking about many sectors in Australia where there won't be mergers because people know they wouldn't get it through, and a good example would be the energy retail sector. There's three main energy retailers in Australia. I don't think any two of those would think they could merge, and so there's many sectors like that. Can't imagine Coles is thinking it might take over Woolworths. And there's a whole range of other activity that people don't engage in because they know it's against the law, and they know that as a fairly active regulator we will take action. So our effect is, I think, larger indirectly than it is directly. Just going to my third topic, or third leg of the argument, I guess, which is that, you know, everyone has a view on what our Act should be, and most people want us to do more. I'm always fascinated by the range of views, particularly when I see a business audience, about what they think we should and shouldn't be doing. I mean, forget about the community where there's a wide range of views, but even amongst a business audience, if you gave them an issue, what do you think we ought to do with that? What do you think we ought to do with that? There is a wide spectrum of views, and everybody has a view. It's not as if there's something they haven't thought about. I'm always amused by the petrol one, where you listen to the radio and they'll say, I saw petrol at $1.40 here and $1.50 there. What's the ACCC doing about it? And then you'll turn to another radio station and they'll say, I saw petrol was $1.50 there and $1.50 there. What's the ACCC doing about that? And then, of course, Alan Jones's line is that if the ACCC was doing its job, petrol would be $1 a litre, not $1.50, which, of course, is pretty hard when you consider the world price plus the tax on fuel puts the price of petrol as it's landed at something north of $1.30. But the point is, people have this view that we can do something about that, as if we control the price of petrol. We've got no powers over the price of petrol. If the price is high in an area because someone's engaging in a cartel or some form of anti-competitive agreement, we can deal with it. But just because somebody might be in an area where they're not facing a lot of competition so they can charge more, That's not against the Act. I don't think anybody here would want that to be against the Act, but a whole lot of people expect us to do something about that when firstly we've got no power to do anything about it, and secondly, nor should we. So what I try to do is try and engage in some of these debates, because I think, you know, to be effective, what we need to do is both actively enforce the Act as it is, and secondly, engage in debates when people think we should be doing things, when in fact it's not actually against the law, and nor should it be. Most of the time when people want us to do more and they say we're not doing enough, which, as I say, is the dominant criticism, it's people wanting us to do things that are not against the law, and I would argue, nor should they be. Now, I am trying to some degree, as best I can, I mean, one has to be careful intervening in public debates, but to try and enter these debates to, because I don't want the ACCC criticised and slammed on the media for not doing things when in fact, A, we can't, and B, we shouldn't anyway. And, you know, the petrol example I gave is a very good example. So we are out there patiently explaining, look, the international price of petrol is, you know, you see the overseas price is this, multiply by the exchange rate, you get that, add the tax on, you get that. You're already north of $1.30, and that's before you think of retail costs. And by the way, as I say, we don't have power to control petrol prices. The more interesting one, almost intellectually, has been the master grocers, who of course are the competitors to Coles and Woolworths, coming out and saying that the ACCC should prevent, on a number of occasions, Coles and Woolworths going into a town and setting up a supermarket where they don't have one now. And their argument is that this is a misuse of market power, because in certain circumstances they're arguing that... I didn't kick anything, did I, Greg? Because in certain circumstances, I usually do knock the microphone, but I don't think it was me on that occasion. In certain circumstances, they're saying, look, what's happening is the supermarkets are building a very big supermarket. It's more capacity than the town needs, and of course they're going to run at a loss for a while. When that report came out, I tried to get out to the media pretty quickly and say, well, look, hang on, any new... I mean, it's conceivable, I guess, but that something like that could be, I can imagine a circumstance where it could be a misuse of market power, but most of the time, whenever you build a new store, well, of course it's got more capacity than the market needs, because the day before you built the store, everyone could buy their goods, so it almost tautologically so. And secondly, well, of course they're going to lose money initially. You wouldn't build a store to be profitable on day one. You might think about 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out. But we get an enormous number of complaints. And of course the complaints are coming often from the people who are going to be on the receiving end of the new competition. I mean, if you are in a town where there isn't a supermarket, say, and a supermarket comes to town, this isn't good news for the local delicatessen, the local baker, the local fruit shop. But our role here is to protect the competitive process, not protect individual competitors. So these are debates that we need to engage in, so that we do explain to people what we can and what we can't do, and, as I say, what we should or shouldn't do. Now, people here may be surprised that we feel, certainly I feel, we should be out there explaining that the law is appropriate, because you could argue that's a role for government. And look, technically that's right, but I don't believe politicians on a day-to-day basis are going to be out there engaging in these sort of debates, and I think the history is that that's right. The companies aren't much out there. They really leave it to us. So, in a sense, that void needs to be filled, otherwise we get laws we don't need, or otherwise we get criticised for reasons that we shouldn't get criticised. I don't think there's any irony in the fact that the ACCC is probably... I mean, we have a very strong belief in both those quotes I mentioned earlier. My guess is that most people put more faith in the second quote than they do in the first, and that's why they want us to do more. I suspect the ACCC is, by community standards, at the more free market end of the equation, which may surprise people, but we have a very well-developed sense of when regulators shouldn't intervene. So the objective that really I've set myself for being at the ACCC is really twofold. It's one, that I hope that through what we do, the market economy works better. And almost more important, I hope that people have more faith that a market economy works for them, that they understand how it should and shouldn't work, and that really it does work in their favour rather than feeling that it's working against them. So thank you. I'll happily take some questions now.